Hey everybody, welcome. I'm glad you all are here. You're going to be glad you're here too. The Oro Valley Historical Society is thrilled that Jim Williams is a past president, current historian, and author of the book Oro Valley, the First 50 Years. You all know that because I'm sure you've read it. There's not going to be a quiz on it, but it's a great book. He's here today to talk to us about Oro Valley from then until now. But he won't tell you everything because you can come back next week, same time, same station, to hear more of the story. Jim Williams.
All right. Thank you. Yeah, this will be a two-day session, and if you know anybody who is interested, they can certainly come the second time. What I'm going to do today is primarily talk up to the period of incorporation, and then go from there, the modern history next week. Let me get my clicker here. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a resident of Oro Valley. I live in Sun City. I've been here 18 years. We moved here in a heat wave in June of 2006, and our air conditioner broke 3 days later. That was our introduction to the heat of Oro Valley. I think it was about 105. But I have been a teacher and an administrator back in Pennsylvania, in southeast Pennsylvania, and I have been working with the Historical Society since 2013. I published a book, Claiming the Desert, in 2018, and published a new book about modern Oro Valley for the 50th anniversary. I had not intended to write a book again, but along came COVID, and I had lots of free time. And I had a lot of material, so I thought if I added to that material, I could perhaps create another book covering this community. What do historians do? They gather information, data, pictures, events, newspaper articles, try to look for patterns and trends, and then organize that information to clearly explain patterns and trends. History is not just a listing of a lot of details. You may have some history teachers that did that. They just went over detail after detail after detail. I think it's more important to explain history and use illustrations to explain major ideas rather than always dwell on all the details, etc. So that's what I've been doing. And you can see newspaper articles. The one thing we have today, which I've mentioned in a couple other talks recently, this is the first research project in 70 years, no, 50 some years of research, I guess. Trying to think, 55 years of research. This is the first project I've ever done primarily through the internet, because there is so much now on the internet that you can do now. Interviews and things like that are extra. But the newspapers.com, ancestry.com, all kinds of sources that can help find the information you want. So let's talk about Arizona and Oro Valley. You probably know that New Mexico and Arizona were the last two states to join the 48. Of the lower 48. And there are a number of reasons for that. For one thing, up until the 1860s, if you look at maps of this area, the name Arizona is often in small print, and the word Apacheria is in large print. Because there were more Native Americans than there were settlers. And this was a dangerous place to come to, certainly until perhaps the mid-1870s. And if you came here, there were simply a few paths from Santa Fe and El Paso that would lead you in this direction. And I mean truly barely a path to get here. So you would have had to walk or pull a cart or ride a horse or maybe a wagon perhaps, so that would have been quite difficult. And most of the people until the Civil War were not coming to Arizona. They were coming through Arizona, going to California. California had gold. California has fertile land. It has a nice climate. And it was more attractive, so most of the people were not staying here until after the American Civil War. And of course, we had the climate problems here. Can you imagine living at the Civil War period in an adobe house with windows, with no screens, no air conditioning, no fans, no nothing, and getting through the summers here and other difficulties? So we didn't become a state until much later. Some of the members of the Congress, even in the early 1900s, said, we don't want Arizona. It's going to be a basket case. It's going to be a dependent state that is always going to need help from the federal government to survive. Oro Valley similarly was delayed in settlement. The darkened line that I created is roughly the path of the Southern Pacific Railroad. The closer you were to the Southern Pacific Railroad, the more valuable your property, because you could get things in and out of here after the early 1880s. Flip my page here. As you can see there, the green areas are parks, but they're also the mountainous areas. So there is only one major route north that doesn't go through the mountains, and that's what we now call Oracle Road. We were far from the railroad, and all of this land up here, actually all of the land north of Grant Road, you know where I'm talking about, in the middle of Tucson, all of the land north of Grant Road was owned by the federal government. Nobody could at that point take the land. They could occupy it, but they couldn't own it because it had not been surveyed or made available yet. So people would come to this area, but they couldn't own the land, and it was a long way from the railroad, so if you raised cattle, you had to get them to the railroad. If you dug ore in the mountains, you had to somehow get that to the railroad. So you can see why Oro Valley would have developed much more slowly than some of the areas closer to the town of the city of Tucson. We have an interface of cultures here. We have Hispanic, Francisco Romero on the left. We have Native American, and we have Anglo. That gentleman, I tried to find his name, I couldn't find it, but he owned a section in Homestead that is now called Shadow Mountain Estates. That was his property. The man on the top right, they would have referred to him as an Anglo, okay? An Anglo is any European of non-Spanish origin. It doesn't mean English like British. It could be a Jew from Poland, it could be a Greek, it could be a Swiss national, a German, and all of those people came here from those different countries. But all of these people are going to intermix in this area, and, okay. Doesn't want to work. Okay. Wow. For the resources in the land of this area, when it became available, and even before it became legally available, various groups are going to compete, push other people out of the way. We always talk about the Apaches of this area, but they were not a native tribe to this area. They came in and pushed other people out, other natives out. And the same thing occurs here. There's going to be a competition for the land and the resources and how to get rich quickly. I just came upon a phrase reading a book about the environment, something the social scientists, environmentalists call the tragedy of the commons. Does that ring a bell with anybody? Tragedy of the commons. I had not heard of that before, but it basically is the idea that any place where there is open land and there's a lot of resources there, there's going to be a competition for it. And many people feel that they're going to take it first because they know somebody else is going to take and make use of the resource anyway. So why not go ahead and take it and get as much as you can out of it? In our area, it would be cattle, but it could be timber, it could be iron ore, other things of that sort. There is not a particular concern about the environment when these people came here. They might have enjoyed the look of the environment, but they weren't really concerned about the long-term survival of it. And so there is going to be a competition and in some ways an overuse of the area.
Do you want to show me what to push?
Just right there, just push on that dot there just to move it to the next one. So we have, first of all, the Native American tribes here. Long ago, the Hohokam, from the 500s to some people argue now as late as the 1400s, a civilization that reached its peak around 1100 in the Common Era. The Honeybee Canyon, which is the next slide. Okay, all right, we'll keep going here. Anyway, that's all right. That was my mistake. The modern tribes would be the Tohono O'odham, which were in the 19th century were called the Papago, and the Apache in the northeast of here. So think of this area here as kind of a no man's land between the Tohono O'odham towards the Santa Cruz River and the Apache to the north. And the Apaches would periodically come into this area. All right, let's leave that one right there. So the earliest settlers, the earliest people that we know of, that were probably even earlier than this, but the Hohokam settled on a bluff in the middle of what is now Catalina State Park. Over 100 people lived on that bluff. It's a section now of the park that's set off and called the Romero Ruins, but that refers to a later settler. They built walls, they built buildings, etc., and they used the bluff for protection. And that area behind there is a slowly rising area towards those mountains, and those were all agricultural fields with canals and directing water all through that area. Okay, next slide. The Apache came here much later. They came from Canada. They were warriors, they were raiders. They thought that stealing livestock was a legitimate occupation. It was what you did to make a living. So they would steal from Tohono O'odham. They would also steal from other tribes, and they would also steal from the Anglo settlers and Hispanic settlers here later. They also attacked travelers and wagons coming through the area, and they were a very, very strong threat to anybody moving here. So if you lived in Tucson at the time of the Civil War, you would have to been very courageous to come way out here, because there would be no protection. Now, about 4 years later, the federal government brought an army into this area under General George Crook, and they largely pacified or dealt with the Native American threat. But until that period, it was quite dangerous. Okay, next slide. So I think we can keep moving there. So again, taking all this information about all the different people, etc., I found a way to organize it was to think of waves of people coming here, non-native people. Just mentioned the native waves coming in, the Tohono O'odham, the Hohokam, and the Apache. But I broke it down into early settlers, homesteaders, and then the major ranchers that came here. And I'm going to talk a little bit about each one of those. And by the way, we're the fourth wave. We're suburbia. So we're the fourth wave coming through this area. Okay, next slide, please. So the earliest settlers that came here, non-native, probably came here between 1865 and 1900. They held no title to the land. They established the early ranches, and am I missing something there? Okay. They held no title to the land, and they all decided to raise cattle here. So imagine coming out of Tucson, and you come up here, and you probably build some kind of a shelter. You would dig a well, because you would need water for any animals, and then you bring cattle here and you let them loose. You've branded them with your brand. So they're going out all over this area between the Tortolita Mountains and the Santa Catalina Mountains, and all the way up to as far as Oracle and all the way down towards Tucson. So no one at this point in the late 19th century owns this area. You brand your cattle, you let them loose, and then sometime in the late fall or winter, you round them up in a rodeo. And you bring them back, and all the skills that we think of the rodeo today are part of the skills of rounding up those animals. And then not only you, but perhaps 5 or 6 other ranchers would get together, and you would all work together to capture all those animals, and then you would divvy them up based on their brands, and then they would be taken either to Tucson for butchering or to the railroads. About half these people, early settlers, were Hispanic and about half Anglo. They were squatters. They did not own any territory. They probably hoped at some point in the future there would be a legal way for them to get that. How's it going?
It says it's got power, but
I think you have to sort of aim it at that. There it goes. Okay, well, let's see how that goes for a while. Thank you. One other characteristic of this period is that there are no fencing. Very few people, you didn't own the ground yet, so why would you fence it? Because you don't, you may or may not be able to get it. Nobody even knew exactly what the parameters would be of the lots that would be available, because that was all still to be determined in the future. The railroads come here in the 1880s, and now you have a way to ship cattle out of here. You have ways to ship ore out of here, and ways to bring in new products and more people. The railroad comes from New Orleans, through El Paso, through New Mexico, and then to Tucson, and then eventually all the way to California. The fact that the railroad comes from New Orleans is very important, because most of the people who are going to come here between 1880 and 1920 are going to be Southerners. And they're going to come and bring their social system that was common to them is going to come to here. And as some of you may know, Tucson was a segregated city until the late 1950s, early 60s. So segregation came with that group of people who came to this area. So the railroads bring in materials that people can use. They bring people who are coming here who hope to get some property eventually. Earliest settlers that we know of, Francisco Romero and George Push. Anglo and Hispanic. George Push was a German immigrant. We know from ship records that he got here in the fall of 1865. He came from the central part of Germany near Frankfurt. And like many people of that era, he traveled all over the West. He didn't just come from New York City and immediately zap right to Tucson and say, well, I'm going to live here. He lived in San Francisco, he lived in Los Angeles, he lived in other cities until eventually he found the place that he was comfortable with, and that would be somewhere around 1873 or 1874. Francisco Romero is a local. His father was a soldier for the army of the Spanish army that was here in the early 1800s in the Presidio. He did some scouting for the Mexican army, because remember, Spain was replaced by Mexico, and then Mexico eventually ceded this territory to the United States. He was the son of a soldier. He had a Mexican land grant where Oracle Road meets Grant Road. If you can think of I-10, I mean, that's a whole like industrial area down there and warehouses and things like that. But that was his original ranch. And he had some dairy cattle on that area. We know from records that have been submitted and are still in existence that he came here at least by 1869, perhaps earlier. He built upon the Native American ruins. I'm sure this was partly crumbled, and we have photographs that he eventually built these walls up to about like here. They were about twice as high as they are today. Pictures were taken in the early 20th century of these ruins that show what he did with them. He established a mine in Ramera Canyon. He raised cattle here. His son developed an orchard out in that flat area, kind of, you know, where the entrance road is, and you go through all that flat. Well, that was an orchard that his son operated there. And he survived in this area. But this was, again, pretty tough, 1869, 1870. Romero and other, primarily Hispanics, wrote a series of petitions to the territorial government. You see 1869 and 1870 there. And one of those pages, or one or two of those pages, are his personal petition saying that he had been attacked, that his home had been attacked by Apaches. They had stolen cattle. They had stolen other things. And you never know where you're going to find these things. I didn't even know this existed. And I looked on Ancestry.com, and I just happened to look up Francisco Romero, and somebody had tagged this document from him, and it's in the Stanford University Library in California. And some very diligent genealogist found a lot of this information. By the way, there are lots and lots of Romeros that still live in the Tucson area that are related to Francisco. His family claimed that when he was buried, he had arrow wounds that were in his body from being hit by arrows in various attacks. But he had one of those Winchester repeating rifles, remember, like the rifleman had on television with the action thing like that. So he survived. Just to mention also one last thing about the Romeros. He and many of the other Hispanics and Anglos were very angry at these Apache raids. And so he and others agreed to form a posse and to go arm themselves and to go north and look for the tribal, the warriors. And they had heard they were in Aravaipa Canyon. Has anyone here ever hiked through Aravaipa Canyon, the water? Yes, it's a narrow, not too high canyon, but to walk through it, you have to walk most of the time in the water. They went up there, they left late at night, and they rode up there in the dark because they wanted to come in secret. And most of the materials were supplied by Sam Hughes, as a name well known in the Tucson area. Well, when they got there, they went up on the bluffs above, and they decided to attack. What they were attacking was primarily women, children, and a few old men. The warriors were off somewhere. And not only did they attack and annihilate over 100 of them, but they took hostages, children, back to them to Tucson. And Romero took a baby back with him, a young child, and made it a house servant. And later, much, much later, the tribe sued for the return of all those children. And they got them back from Romero and other families. So George Push establishes Steam Pump Ranch. He was a butcher. His documentation getting into the country mentions that he is a butcher from Germany. He establishes a shop in downtown Tucson, which is kind of an open-air shop. The Historical Society has photographs of it. He works in cooperation with a Swiss national by the name of Johann Zellweger, and they are partners in many things, including a meat processing plant, establishing the ranch out here, and raising cattle in this area. So he, like many people, is coming here to make the quick kill. You know, there is all this open land. He's a butcher. He has a meat processing plant. All he needs is more meat. And so he is going to establish a ranch out here and make as much as he can, as quickly as he can. He also established a ranch on the San Pedro River, a much bigger ranch where more of the cattle were raised. This ranch is more of a way station between the ranch on the San Pedro River north of Oracle and Tucson. He had a steam pipe imported. I don't think it was the first steam pump in Arizona, but it was one of the early ones. And that allowed him to draw water from a deeper level so that he could water his cattle and other people's cattle for a fee. This is a picture in the late 19th century, perhaps early 20th century, with him and his wife and two of his children. Unfortunately, many of these people, they refer to these waves of people coming out with the idea of making a great deal of money as bonanzas. Remember the television show? Bonanzas. An opportunity to really make use of the extractive process. Extract ore, cut down lumber, or use the grass to feed the animals. The unfortunate part is that these cows didn't know that they had to be ecologically sensitive. They ate the whole thing. They pulled the grass out by the roots, and so next year that grass is no longer there. And within 10 years, it was no longer as easy or profitable to make a great deal of money. In fact, many of the cattle after 1890 are only raised for a year here, and then they're shipped to California to be fattened up, which made it less profitable. You know, if you could just let these animals loose, let them graze on all the material, and then collect them and sell them, hey, that's a gold mine. But it didn't last for too long. Second wave, the homesteaders. Now, some of the people that I mentioned and some other people who were those early settlers did end up with homesteads. But they were not the majority of the people who would be called homesteaders. Most of the homesteaders settled here between 1903 and 1940. They claimed anywhere from 40 to 640 acres. 640 acres is a square mile. That was the most you could claim. And you obtained a title to the land. And of course, if you attained a title to the land, then you also wanted to protect it, so you put a barbed wire fence around it. So that's the end of the open range. You may remember that old Cole Porter song, give me land, and starry skies above, but don't fence me in. That was written about that process of putting up all those fences. It's hard to be a cowboy when you can only go 1 mile, and then you're fenced in by that area. I mean, there were some ways to get around that. These people came from all over the United States. They came from Europe. There were actually a few black gentlemen who claimed land, but mostly Anglos and Hispanics. Probably about 2/3 Anglo and 1/3 Hispanic. There was a rough proportion. For approximately $25 plus another $10 for the deed, you could claim 40 acres, but you could also claim 640 acres for the same amount of money. It's interesting to me that some people only claim 40 acres, but a lot of them did. But some people claimed more and held on to that land. They built themselves an adobe house. They may have built some kind of an entryway like the Moonglow Ranch there to make it look very, very important. But they did settle in this area between the 1900 and 1940. Of course, before that could happen, we're going to take a little break for 1 second here. Change the battery. All set. Okay. A friend of mine, Clive Probert, created this map for me, and he shows you the 4 townships that were established, of which Oro Valley is pretty much most of that land. You can see the rough outline of the green of Oro Valley, though that is Oro Valley perhaps 7 years ago, so it's probably changed slightly. But the greenish area is Oro Valley today, and part of Oro Valley is in each one of these 4 townships. This township over here, 1214, is almost all mountains. And so the federal government retained most of that, and it was made a forest preserve about 1905 by Teddy Roosevelt in that era. And of course, it still remains a forest preserve of the United States. But you'll notice the lines are so precise. And do you notice where the roads are in Oro Valley? They're kind of basically decided on, this I'm pretty sure is a 160-acre square section. There have been some changes to the roads, but our roads are generally drawn between sections within this. So each one of these townships would have been divided into 36 sections, and they were subdivided then into 4 40-acre sections. So 160 acres, section 36 of them. So it's a square mile. It's not a square mile, but it's a square that includes all those 640-acre sections. Also notice the big dividing line, Tangerine Road and First Avenue. First Avenue is the red coming down, and Tangerine is the bluish one going east and west in the middle. So when you're at the Walgreens there at First and Tangerine, you're kind of right in the middle of those 4 townships. And these were all laid out by the government, but then had to be surveyed. So people came out here in horseback starting in 1901 with a pole and a transom and a chain. And they would do 100 feet sections at a time. And they would put a marker in the ground and then another marker and another marker and another marker. And they did all this by horseback. Unfortunately for us today, most of those markers are gone because they're right in the middle of those roads. So I'm sure if you had driven along Tangerine at one point, there would have been some of those markers still seen. Many of them were a pipe coming out of the ground. or a big stone that they had chiseled the appropriate numbers on it of where it was. So starting in 1903, this section over here, well, it says 1901, it was surveyed, but starting in 1903, you could begin to take from this section right here. This section up here was the last one settled. And I think that would partly have to do with the fact that it was the farthest from Oracle Road. So it would have been the most difficult to get to, because those other roads that we see today didn't exist yet. So homesteading life. These are some pictures of ruins. That on the right was a ruin in the middle of Catalina State Park. Unfortunately, when the park was built, they made a decision, fortunately, unfortunately, I'm not sure, but they decided to tear down all the homesteader ruins. And they didn't, I wish they had at least left the foundation there, but they bulldozed them and got rid of them. Because they were afraid kids would get in there and fool with them and the wall would fall on somebody. So the ruins were there as late as 1982, 83. The one on the left was not far from the southern border of Oro Valley Country Club. And the story goes with that family that they bought the land, but they didn't pay for a survey. Because you could have it surveyed yourself to make sure what the exact borders were. Well, the father didn't make a lot of money. He worked for the state highway department. So they bought the land, but they didn't have it surveyed. They built the house and they discovered it was 100 feet on the other next door property. It was off by 100 feet. So what to do? They got a bunch of telephone poles and brought them in and lifted the house up onto the telephone poles and rolled it to the other property so that it could be right on their correct property. Ingenuity was a big part of being a homesteader. 640 acres seemed like a lot of land, but if you're raising cattle, it is not enough land. One head of cattle requires anywhere from 25 to 40 acres of land and forage. You don't make money by bringing in feed for cattle. It's too expensive. So many of these people found out they could only raise a small number of cattle on this property because it is fenced in. Now what they often did was then go to a neighbor and said, well, if you're not going to raise cattle, can I use yours? And you'll get a couple of the head when we're all finished. The first thing they had to do probably before they did anything else was dig a well. And wells were dug by hand. And they would dig anywhere from 25 to 100 feet down looking for water. They would start with a well perhaps 8 or 9 feet wide and then gradually narrow it down because they didn't want it caving in on them. But still, it was quite a dangerous thing to do. The early people built their homes out of stone and out of adobe, and later people in the 1920s and 30s, like that house on the left, would have built a small frame house. But you can see, if you've seen any of the homesteader ruins around here, most of the houses, 4 or 5 of them would fit in this room. They were pretty small places to live. They did have public school here. Tucson had, I believe, 18 or 19 school districts, Pima County had 18 or 19 school districts. And this area here, from the Pinal County line all the way to River Road, was one school district called the Catalina School District. It was established in the 1890s and it lasted until the 1840s. And there are some people still alive here who went to the local school. This was the one-room schoolhouse. which was on Oracle Road, opposite the Oro Valley Marketplace. As you're starting up the hill, look off to the right and you'll see a little building there. That is what remains of the one-room schoolhouse. It has been heavily modified, so I don't know that anybody would consider it historic, but it is the location and the frame of the original schoolhouse. And you see the children pledging allegiance to the flag. The student body was more Hispanic than it was Anglo. And if you graduated from here in the 8th grade, you went to Tucson High School, if you could find a way to get there every day. And the students would often be mocked by the children in Tucson because they spoke English, but with a very heavy Hispanic accent, even if they were Anglo, because they were living among the Hispanic children. Amusements for children, riding a horse, we have records of people who had left notes of what they did. They would often go to swim in Romero pools. Does that ring a bell with anybody? Romero pools, the water's not very deep there, but it would be spring water coming through there all summer long. They helped their parents. They went to school. By the way, this was the poorest school district in all of Pima County. They could barely afford to pay for one teacher. The entire budget for a year was perhaps $1,000 or $2,000 for everything involving the school district. And they had a library that would easily fit on one of these tables. So it was one-room school of that era. And of course, it was quite isolated. One of the examples of the Hispanic family, this family lived right where the entrance of the Oro Valley Marketplace is today. They had a considerable ranch there, and Francisco and his brother had another ranch on the other side. So there was, on the entrance of Catalina State Park was one Marin Ranch, and on the west side was a second Marin Ranch. Marin was a teamster. A lot of the people who ended up here were teamsters because they had driven wagons through this area and they liked it. And when they stopped being a teamster, then they settled here and established a ranch. So the two brothers Marin lived here with their families, and for about 15 years, in the late 19th century and early 20th century, the Francisco Marin Ranch was a stagecoach stop. And if you're ever interested, you can go to the Arizona Historical Society, and they have a huge ledger for every trip that stagecoach took. And they have a listing of who was on the stagecoach, where they got on, where they got off, and what they were carrying. It was more important what they were carrying than the people, because they could bring things to people out here that they couldn't get. And so they would stop at the Marin Ranch and unload passengers and, more importantly, unload freight, seed and clothing and things like that people couldn't get on their own. And then they switched horses right there. Why? Well, when you're driving up there, when you know where the entrance to Oro Valley Marketplace is, and then all of a sudden you head up that big hill. Now, in your V8 engine, that's not a big deal. But getting a horse with people, a wagon, and supplies up that hill was a big deal. So they had to have fresh horses to get up there. And from there, they would go all the way onto Oracle. So many of those people who were teamsters and were wagon drivers and stagecoach drivers, quite a few of them ended up living here. We also had about 10 women who claimed homesteads on their own. The law was written at that time that if a man and a wife, husband and wife, took a homestead, it was automatically put in the man's name. So there's no mention of the woman. Now, if he died, she inherited it. But legally, if there's a husband and wife, it's his. But single women could come out here on their own. Can you imagine what that was like for a single woman to come out into this open area and either do the work or others get the work done? Probably the most famous of those is a woman by the name of Ina Giddings. She was a professor of physical education at the University of Arizona, and there is a hall named for her on the far eastern side of the campus. She was a pioneer because she went to college, and she was one of the first people to come to this area to teach physical education to women. Prior to this, the thinking was that women should not participate in sports, and she helped change that. She was a professor there from the World War I period, right after World War I, until the mid-1950s. She lived in a home in what is now in the middle of the campus, but it was part of the private property then. And this is a picture of her. I was able to obtain these pictures from one of her nephews, or great-nephews. I'm not sure, nephew or great-nephew. And she established a homestead on Ina Road. And she wrote a series of letters to the newspaper saying, "Please pronounce my road correctly. It's Ina Road. It's not Ina Road." That never took. She used to invite her girl students on the weekends to come to her homestead. And they would get horses from the university, because, you know, they had a polo and all that stuff. And they would ride all the way to La Cholla and Ina Road. And that's where her property was. But she also owned a lot of land very close to Sun City. Not everybody was able to get 640 acres of contiguous land. So sometimes they got 300 here and 400 there, and you know, it wasn't always a perfect square. It depended on how many people had asked for that. So these people had to take care of themselves. Particularly if there was a man and a woman, the woman was expected to take care of the house, take care of the garden, take care of the kids, do the sewing, do all that kind of business, keep the house clean as possible, though most of them had dirt floors. So it must have been very difficult to try to keep any kind of cleanliness with the dust, etc. And they also were the medical technician. If somebody got hurt, they were the person to take care of it. If you're living way out here, you're not getting in a buckboard and going all the way to Tucson for a doctor. Number one, they didn't have the money for it, and number two, they probably wouldn't have been able to get there in time. So the mother or whatever female was in the area had to have some medical skills, and they had to find ways to save people. Starting in the 1920s and continuing until the 1950s, another group of people began to move here. They were quite different in that they were much more economically successful when they got here. Many of them had big businesses in Ohio, Illinois, other states. And many of them came here as winter visitors. During the Depression, many of those original homesteaders could not afford to pay the real estate tax, which was generally on a piece of open land between $2 and $7 a year. But they didn't have $2 or $7. Or many of them had mortgaged their properties because they wanted to buy a piece of equipment, and then when the Depression came, they couldn't pay the mortgage. Either way, sure of sale. The property is available. And so these people come along just as many people are losing their properties. And they're going to buy up many of these for a very small amount of money. If I had spent $35 buying a homestead, and I built some little Adobe three-room building on it, and somebody came by and offered me $500, you would take that. That would be a big profit in the Great Depression. People were only making, on an average, about $800 a year in the Great Depression. So these people could come along and buy up. They're going to be gentleman ranchers. They're not going to be digging wells and tending cattle. They're going to have a foreman, they're going to have ranch hands and various people to do all that work. And many of them are only going to be here from October till April. Sound familiar? So they begin to consolidate the land into large sections. And as I'll talk about next week, that has tremendous implications for the way Oro Valley was developed. Because it's not, it's not 80 different little sections all over the place, but there are many of these have been grouped together by these people starting in the 30s and going until the 1950s. So they're winter visitors. They come to the hotels. They come to the places with the swimming pools. There's a gentleman who had a homestead here, and now the name escapes me, but he had a homestead where the Hilton El Conquistador is. And he also was involved in the motion picture industry, and he and his wife established a little company, and they employed several cameramen, and they would go around and take little 3-4 minute clips of interesting things in the desert. Things like girls dressed up at a swimming pool with cactus covering them. A lot of pictures of girls in bathing suits around swimming pools. Because what they did with these was sell these as newsreels on the old motion picture. Remember when there used to be a newsreel in between features, etc.? And people back east would see these pictures like this, and they would say, wow, I think I want to go out there in the wintertime. So they would come and stay at a dude ranch, the Pioneer Hotel, one of the other hotels. And then after they came several winters and they had kind of looked the area over, they thought, maybe I think I want to have a ranch. And it wasn't going to cost that much money. One of them was Joseph McAdams and his wife, Lila. And the map that I have here, this is a map of Catalina State Park. And the outline in color is their ranch. So their ranch made up, what, 2/3 of Catalina State Park. So McAdams was a owner of a steel plant in Cincinnati, Ohio. He and his wife came out here in the 30s. They bought this land, and they built a house right where that dot is, and that house is still there today. It's on Oracle Road, about 100 yards north of Tangerine, on the right-hand side, way back in. I've been through the house, it's very interesting. And they built a swimming pool, and they had cattle on the ranch. They had 5 or 6 different corrals, and they enjoyed that area, and they certainly were not going to be doing a lot of work. The house was built in the late 30s, early 1940, and it was designed by Josiah Josler, which made it important. It's an unusual home. It has 5 bedrooms, and each bedroom has a bathroom. And a servant's quarters, and a huge living room. It's probably at least as big as this area here. Actually maybe a little bigger than this area, is a living room with beautiful windows looking out over the mountains. And we'll talk about that next week also. Walter McDonald was a single gentleman. He owned a printing company in Ohio. He came here in the 30s, and in 1946, he bought out someone else who had been accumulating land just north of Steam Pump Ranch. It didn't have a name at that time. It was owned by Joseph Melrose, and Melrose sold it to him in 1946 for, I think, about $50,000. I don't have the exact number in my head. And he would come here every winter. He was a member of the Tucson Country Club. He subsidized opera here and helped make sure it continued. He had a home on this ranch, but his real home was over on the road to Mount Lemmon. In fact, there's a park over there named McDonald Park for him. He donated that land to Pima County. He was active in the area, and he established a ranch. And about 1953, he started to refer to it as Rancho Vistoso. And that's the beginning of Rancho Vistoso. It was 4,500 acres. I should make a quick point here about this. Many of these people did not own the entire ranch. Because perhaps if you can think of this room, perhaps they owned like this section here, and that section over there, and this section here, and that section over there. And the land in between was owned by the state. And they could rent that. They could lease it for a very nominal fee. So he owned perhaps 3,000 acres, and the rest of it was land that the state allowed him to use. So he could have a contiguous ranch. These people entertained. This is a picture from the Proctor Lieber house. They rode horses. They had swimming pools. They invited celebrities to come up, and many of them were invited by somebody else, and then they got the bug to buy. So they would spend a weekend or a couple of days at one of these ranches. Many of them came to Steam Pump Ranch, and then they would go and buy their own ranch. So by the late 1940s, early 1950s, there wasn't much open ground left. There were lots of other people here, however, people like Buster Bailey, lots of poor people. You know, the average person was a poor person here. There were like, perhaps, I'm going to hold off for a second. Okay. There were the Golders, and there were Walter McDonald and people like that, and they lived a level way above everybody else. I think you could safely say in the 1930s and 40s, there was no middle class in Oro Valley. There were wealthy people, and there were very poor people. And the very poor people were ranch hands, tenant farmers, people who did odd jobs. Buster Bailey is a good example of this because he came here with his parents from Texas in 1928. And his parents established a gas station on Oracle Road in 1929. Not a good time to start a business. The business failed about a year later, and they went back to Texas. And Buster said, I'm staying here. I like it here. I'm going to find a way to make a living here. So in the Great Depression, what did people do? Well, he thought of himself as a cowboy, but he was not a cowboy. He was a mechanic. He was a very gifted automobile mechanic, the kind of person who could figure out how an engine works and repair it. During World War II, he repaired Jeeps in the Philippines. He was stationed there. You did just a little bit of everything. You might have an illegal still and make alcohol during Prohibition. And there's lots of remnants of old stills in this area, sheet metal out in the desert. It wasn't because somebody had a steam engine out there. It was probably a still. You pick cotton. There was wild cotton in Romero Canyon, and you could pick it and fill up a bag and sell it. Can you imagine how long that would take to fill one of those big sacks? You dug wells. How do we know all this? Well, fortunately, Buster Bailey in his old age began to write down what this area was like. And he wrote a series of essays on tablet paper. And he wrote about the people here and what they did and how did you dig a well here. And you always checked when you came back the second day to see if there were any rattlesnakes down there before you started digging again. And he has a lot of those things. It's a very interesting commentary on the era and the people that were lived here. Unfortunately, he did not begin writing this until many years later, and there's some confusion of names and places, etc. But it's still a very valuable listing. So if you don't know what to do with your time, write down your own history and save it. Could you have been a settler? Could you have come out here and rode a car, rode a truck, rode a wagon, dug a well, built a house? By the way, to keep the property as a homestead, you had to improve it. So if you didn't do anything to it, you couldn't get a deed. But what people often did was they said, well, your ranch is over there, and I'll sign the deed that says you build a house. And if you signed an affidavit that says I built a house. And somehow they got around it in that way. But you had to be self-reliant. You had to be willing to live in isolation. The streams that we have around here frequently flooded, like the CDO Wash. And when those things flooded, you could not get across them. Do you remember what Catalina State Park looked like last year when they had all those floods? It wasn't just the water, but all that wet sand to get through it, so you're not getting a car through that. There's no electricity. There are no fans. There are no swamp coolers. There are no air conditioners. You have to find a way to keep cool here. What they often did at that period was if they had an ice box and they had old ice, they would take their sheets at night and soak them in ice water and then wrap everybody like a mummy. And that evaporation would make you feel cooler. So you had to be innovative. You had to be able to survive on your own. And you also had to find a way to make a living. Not very easy here. I'm sure most of us would not have lived as long as we have lived today if we had been in that situation. And many of them did not live long lives because if they had a medical condition, many of them could not afford treatment. Post-World War II, Arizona in the Sun Belt. Arizona begins to grow. People want to come here. During the war, many people came here to military bases, or they traveled through here on the way to the West Coast to the Pacific Theater. People spent time here in the military, particularly in training in aircraft, flying, navigating, etc. And when the war was over, they thought, I would like to come back to a place like this. Also, there was an aircraft industry that went along with the aircraft training here. Planes were built here. People came here to work, and then they decided to either come back or stay here. In 1938 or 39, somebody in Tucson invented the swamp cooler. Have any of you ever seen or lived with a swamp cooler?
Oh, yes.
It only brings the temperature down about 7 or 8 degrees. So if it's 110 outside, it feels a little better. It's basically circulating moisture around your house. But then in the 1950s, air conditioning became available. And people often say, the Midwest came here when we finally got air conditioning. people largely in the post-war period came not from the South, but from the Midwest. And they came to this very unpopulated state. We had 2 senators, but only 1 member of the House of Representatives. That means you were a very small state. That 1 member of the House of Representatives had to go and travel over the entire state to visit with constituents. We went from cars like at the top to cars as in the bottom. More aerodynamic cars, straighter roads, paved roads, and faster cars with V8 engines. So the roads had to be improved. So the first road that really had to be changed around here was Oracle. Oracle Road is likely an Indian path or a military path up to Camp Grant. And it just kind of meanders all through the area, I'm sure looking for the best elevation to be able to get horses and wagons up through the area. But more and more roads are going to be built like this. I'm sure you've all had gelato at Frost, right? Well, if you came here in 1950, you'd be in the middle of Oracle Road. Frost, that Oracle Road took a big swing there and went through that whole Casas Adobe shopping center. Where I mentioned before where the school is, from Tangerine coming down that hill, that whole road had to be re-engineered because people frequently were killed on that road. They would come down too fast and the curve was too sharp. If you come down, if you remember where the entrance is to Catalina State Park, you know where the sign is, the big sign? If you go about another 100 feet, you'll notice there's a dirt road there. That's Oracle Road. That's the original Oracle Road right there. It's just a dirt path there. There's one property that you can enter from that. So the roads are going to be improved. They're going to be paved. Oracle is a 2-lane road in 1950. They said, by the way, in the 30s that they were paved, but they were not paved. They had gravel and they put oil on them periodically and would wash away in the rain. All right, we're going to go just a little further. And we have the beginnings of suburbia. In the 1930s, an English couple owned a section called the Linda Vista area. And they asked the county to allow them to subdivide it. So in 1935, we had our first subdivision here of the area along Linda Vista Boulevard. They were generally large lots because originally many people thought of having a little ranch out here rather than a suburban kind of housing. Campobello, 1948. How many people know where that is? A couple people do. It's between Hardy Road and Cali Concordia to the west of Oracle. It's in about a mile, half a mile back. It's an unusual development. It's a 160-acre homestead section, and it is divided into 5-acre ranchettes. And most of the people still have horses back there. The roads are not paved, and they don't want you really driving through there. If they paved it, more people would drive through there. So it's kind of a little nook of early suburbia through this area. The Countess of Suffolk came here in the 1930s. She was one of those wealthy people. She was a daughter of a gentleman who owned a department store in Chicago. She was sent to England to find a member of nobility to marry. It's kind of like Downton Abbey. She had the money and he had the title. And she married the Earl of Suffolk and lived happily ever after until he was killed in World War I. He died in 1916, and she became the Dowager Countess. She's not an earless, a countess. That's a painting of her. And she had a home built, which is still existing. It's part of the Immaculate Heart Complex, and it has been occupied by nuns, though I understand the high school is closing, so I don't know exactly what's going to be happening there. But she sold the property in 1958 to the Lusk Corporation, a big developer all over the West, and they began building Suffolk Hills, one of the original suburban developments of our area, and it won awards because, again, it's behind Trader Joe's. So that whole area behind Trader Joe's is Suffolk Hills, and it's very interesting because it's very hilly, and it's very natural, and the homes were meant to be in a natural desert environment. So sometime drive through there and just take a look at that development. And my last slide is going to be the development of Oro Valley Country Club Estates. This is the origin of the word Oro Valley. A gentleman by the name of Lou Landon developed plans in 1958 to build homes, a golf course, a huge resort hotel, a lake for boating, a huge swimming pool, and other activities. Eventually, all of that fell through except the golf course and the houses. And starting in 1959, they built the golf course first, and this was a sort of a new concept of building a golf course and then intertwining the houses around it, because that made those houses very valuable because they were sitting on a golf course. I believe that had already started in Florida, but it was the first example in this area. And this became the home of probably the wealthiest people who moved to suburbia here in the post-war period. So I've kind of taken you up to the end of my first book. That's kind of the end of that one. And next week we will get into the second one. Does anyone have any questions? Yes, sir.
The wealthy people came here in the 30s. I assume most of them took a train. Did any of them drive?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I'm sure some people would drive, but the roads were so poor.
Yeah, this is pretty isolated, wasn't it? The state?
Yes, and the roads from here, from Texas to here, were very poor. So, you know, and the tires they had in those days were those pneumatic tires, you know, like a bicycle tire. It would have been very difficult. If you could afford to, you came by train. And all those wealthy people that I mentioned, they would come out by train, and they would have big steamer trunks with all of their things because they were staying for months. They weren't planning just to come for a week kind of thing. Other questions? Anyone else?
All right, in line with that, how did they get around here? With their rental cars?
Well, you know, I don't know, but I would think they would have hired someone in town who would have had a car and would have driven them when they wanted to go somewhere, because there was almost no public transportation. I'm not sure. I'm not sure how they would have done that, but a lot of times, like there were dude ranches all around here, and they would have a car which would go to the railroad station and pick you up and bring you back, you know, all the way from the railroad station all the way to the middle of Oro Valley. Maybe there was a dude ranch in the middle of Catalina State Park. So they would have had a truck or an automobile, something that they would have been able to pick you up. But, you know, beyond that, I don't know where you would have driven or how.
The name Oro Valley, do you know?
Well, we'll get to that next week, but they originally did not plan to use that name, but as a second fallback name, they chose it because it was associated with this wealthy development, and they wanted those people to support the creation of the town. And so it was a way of involving a number of people in creating the town. Yes, sir.
What was the population circa 1958?
1950?
Yeah.
Oh boy, probably I'll just take a rough estimate, from from River Road to the county line, maybe 200 or 300 people. I have that figure somewhere. I'll try and find that for next week, because I did actually go through the census records and calculate how many people lived here. there were several private schools that lived here, and they made up the biggest portion of the population. Because some of the schools had 60 students. Well, that was almost equal to what was here. Anybody else? Well, if anyone's interested and has not obtained a book, I have them up here, and I hope you come back next week. Thank you.